Assisted reproductive technologies, or as it's commonly known, ART. If you're looking at a nation facing a plummeting birth rate, this feels like the ultimate medical silver bullet, right? Just use science to fix the population decline. But when we really dig into the source material for this explainer, the reality of trying to engineer a baby boom is way more complicated than the flashy headlines suggest.
Consider this number, 0.87. That is Singapore's projected total fertility rate for the year 2026. To put the sheer gravity of that number into perspective, a population needs a replacement rate of 2.1 just to stay stable. So hitting 0.87, that's an existential demographic threat. And naturally, it's triggered some very loud calls for the government to just step in, open the checkbook, and fund our way out of this with fertility treatments.
But to understand why science alone isn't a quick fix, we need to audit the actual policy proposals. We'll be walking through these 5 crucial areas, from the limits of IVF to the ethical hurdles, impartially breaking down what the data actually tells us.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Singapore's demographic crisis and the intuitive solution.
So when a population starts shrinking, the immediate knee-jerk demand from a lot of aspiring parents is to pour public funding into expanding IVF. The argument goes like this: enhance the subsidies, loosen up those restrictive regulations, and boom, we can engineer a population surge. And honestly, it sounds entirely logical. But before we write that check, we really have to look at the global data.
Here is the real kicker. In developed nations all over the world, IVF and ART contribute a maximum of just 10% to total live births. Let that sink in. That means 90% of babies are happening entirely outside of these medical interventions. Now, a 10% boost is obviously wonderful for those specific families, but on a macro national level, it's basically a drop in the bucket. It simply cannot close the massive gap of a fertility rate sitting below 1.0.
Which brings us nicely to Section 2, funding and the limits of IVF.
You think the tough reality here is that just throwing more public money at the problem gives us severely diminishing returns. As financial assistance expands, those new funds don't actually trigger a broad population boom. Instead, they get swallowed up by highly complex, incredibly expensive medical cases. So you end up spending vastly more taxpayer money only to benefit a progressively smaller and smaller pool of patients.
And that brings up a really glaring policy contradiction pointed out in the source. A lot of advocates demand that public subsidies be extended to private IVF clinics to help cut down wait times. But wait a minute, these private clinics are profit-driven. They absolutely do not offer public subsidies for treatments fighting deadly diseases like cancer or heart disease. So why should public funds subsidize private fertility treatments when that same money could be used to expand critical, life-saving services in public hospitals?
Okay, let's turn to a really fascinating topic in Section 3, the egg freezing paradox.
Right now, there's a ton of buzz about expanding subsidies and pushing the age limits past 37 for elective egg freezing. It's often pitched as the ultimate way to just buy women some time. But overseas studies reveal a pretty staggering reality. Less than 1 in 10 women will ever actually use their frozen eggs. 90% of them literally just sit in storage untouched. Broadly subsidizing this with public healthcare funds risks a massive systemic waste of resources.
So why on earth do 90% of those eggs go unused? Well, it's not a medical glitch, it's a structural one. Our source points to something called the mating gap. In places like Singapore, you have more women graduating from universities than men. Yet, traditional societal pressures still strongly expect women to marry men with equal or higher education. This incompatibility flat-out prevents many from finding partners. A medical subsidy simply cannot fix a deeply ingrained societal marriage expectation.
Now, because we have a huge shortage of donated eggs, mostly because paying donors is strictly banned to prevent financial coercion, some folks have proposed a pretty controversial workaround. They suggest paying these women for their unused frozen eggs to help them recoup their initial medical fees. But critics fiercely push back on this. They argue you absolutely cannot retroactively transform a private medical choice made for personal reasons into a publicly funded donation expense. It completely blurs the line into a commercial transaction.
Let's dive a bit deeper into these tricky areas in Section 4, ethics, genetics, and donors.
On paper, normalizing genetic screening for older mothers to catch abnormalities sounds absolutely brilliant, right? But take a look at this massive multi-million-dollar payout from an Australian clinic. It perfectly highlights the severe risks of relying on unproven tests. Professional medical bodies in the US and the UK actively caution against widespread genetic screening for this exact reason. It's led to terrible misdiagnoses where perfectly viable, perfectly healthy embryos were mistakenly discarded, entirely ruining a patient's chance at parenthood.
Then we've got the incredibly thorny issue of surrogacy. Legalizing it might seem like a totally altruistic move for infertile couples, but the source flags a massive risk here. It carries the heavy danger of spawning a commercial black market. You could see under-the-table agencies sourcing surrogate mothers from less economically developed countries. And this isn't just an ethical nightmare. It risks massive international diplomatic fallout over transnational child custody rights.
We're also looking at a massive legal contradiction when it comes to who actually gets access to this tech. Expanding IVF to encourage non-traditional family formation, like for single women or same-sex couples, is completely incongruous with current laws. You can't logically permit same-sex IVF while simultaneously prohibiting same-sex marriage. Nor can you permit single women to use sperm donors while public housing policies actively discriminate against unmarried mothers. The legal framework has to be consistent.
All right, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Future Tech and Social Hurdles. So with all these limits on current tech, aspiring parents and policymakers are obviously looking toward tomorrow's science. We're talking about things like IVG, which actually aims to create functional sperm or eggs from regular body cells, or mitochondrial transfer therapy, which you might have heard called three-parent IVF, where they replace poor egg contents with healthy ones from a young donor. These sound like absolute miracles for severe fertility cases.
But let's do a quick reality check on the economics here. These futuristic treatments, they'd only benefit a tiny, super niche pool of patients. And because local research in Singapore is currently pretty far behind, jumping headfirst into this wildly expensive race right now just doesn't make financial sense. The source recommends a much smarter, more prudent approach. Save taxpayer money by waiting for these technologies to be fully proven and safe abroad, and then simply import them through licensing agreements later on.
So, if 90% of births are still happening entirely naturally, and our medical tech is hitting a wall with diminishing returns, ethical minefields, and deep societal issues like the mating gap, we really have to step back and ask ourselves, can science truly solve a demographic crisis, or are we literally just treating the symptoms of a much deeper societal shift? Figuring out how we balance ethical integrity, public resources, and the very survival of a population is a conversation we absolutely all need to be having. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it gave you something to think about.